This is episode 106 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. Wally, despite the fact that the Gessing family is on a epic road trip to the eastern part of our country, we are continuing the podcast for the next couple of weeks. Still plenty to talk about, still things going on in New Mexico public policy. Good to talk to you.
Great to talk to you, and this will be a test of cell phone and Wi-Fi services across this great country of ours. But you're sounding good now, and it's great to be on the podcast with you, Paul.
Exactly, yes. Currently in Springfield, Missouri, heading to Springfield, Illinois, the land of Lincoln, for the next installment, at least our next installment of driving across the country. But Wally, there's still a lot to talk about this NBC Universal deal that everybody, the governor, the mayor, are all touting as wonderful. Of course, it was no surprise recently when Albuquerque City Council adopted a LEDA budget, $3 million for NBC Universal. The state's got their $7.7 million, which I think they already had in the bank. So the LEDA money is a done deal. 9.3 years of this deal. The mortgage, the lease, will be paid for by the taxpayers. So NBC is putting literally nothing up in terms of investment in this city, this state. And there's a provision in this document that I wanted to highlight that was brought to my attention. And it's subparagraph F on page, I believe, 16 of the city's document, which you can find either online or at heirsoфenchantment.com. The post is titled, "Lest You Think NBC Universal is, quote, in it for the long haul in New Mexico." The provision says, "Notwithstanding anything to the contrary in this agreement, the NBC Universal commitment is contingent upon continuation of the state of New Mexico film tax credit program at a level of no less than $50 million per fiscal year and a percentage refundable tax credit of no less than 25% per the New Mexico Film Production Tax Credit Act." And it goes into the chapter on that. Wally, I know we've talked a lot about film subsidies. It's kind of the new issue that really is driving a lot of attention, given the generosity of those incentives that we saw passed during the 2019 session. But pretty interesting stuff there, especially the willingness to leave in general, but also that they are willing to bail if the subsidy level overall goes below $50 million annually. That seems a little strange because the 25% is the other component. That makes sense. They don't want to see that subsidy rate drop, but somehow it seems like this is an escape clause in case somebody else comes along with a much more generous plan and filmmakers start to leave New Mexico, and we're spending then less than $50 million annually on film subsidies. Interested in your thoughts on this one.
Well, my initial reaction was that it reminded me a little bit of a poison pill, something that corporations have used to make takeovers difficult. And so this reminds me of something that would make it difficult for lawmakers to change this. Can they change it? Absolutely. Will they? We will have to see. And, at the rate this thing is going, maybe the 50 million isn't that big of a thing. But if these things keep going at the rate they're going, New Mexico may have to figure out how to pay ever increasing amounts of the film subsidy well above the $50 million a year level. And then people are already starting to ask the question, at what point do we say, uncle, is it just too much for our economy? We could have done that at zero. We didn't. It's at 50 million, then up to 100 million. And so where is that magic point that we just won't be able to take it anymore?
Yeah, I suppose that if the economy went sideways, oil prices or something dropped, and we just didn't have the money, and that they put a cap, say, of $40 million on it annually, something like that would definitely make NBC Universal a little concerned about the status of its industry in New Mexico. But it's worth noting, astute observers, readers of that bill, will note that NBC Universal is completely exempt from any $50 million cap or $110 million cap. They are unlimited in the subsidies that they can pull out of the New Mexico State Treasury because of that 10-year investment that studio purchase gave them essentially a get out of jail free card when it comes to any subsidy cap. So I don't know what the strategy is. Sometimes I'm sure the attorneys just put things in without a specific reason for it. Obviously, the 25% credit, they want to see that money continue to flow onto their books. But the $50 million almost seems like just in case somebody out there comes along with a better deal that they can get out of that. But it is clear, if you had something that was irreplaceable, for example, Facebook, a deal we criticize at the Rio Grande Foundation, but there's no doubt that Facebook, by building an entire data center there in Los Lunas, was making a serious commitment. And so when the state came along and said, you are probably going to have to pay, tens of millions of dollars for this new electrical grid upgrade that's supposed to benefit your data center, Facebook wasn't out there saying we're gonna leave, we're gonna look elsewhere. They've already built a plant, a facility, and they've got it in the ground. They could abandon that investment, but it seems to me that the cost of abandoning that investment was going to be greater than even paying, I think it was close to $40 million, as I recall, that they were contemplating charging Facebook. So there could be discussions going on behind the scenes at Facebook that we're not privy to, but boy, the level of commitment is far different. And like I said, as you know, we've criticized the Facebook deal, but it's nothing. It pales in comparison to the film subsidies that the state dishes out.
Absolutely. And it is, this is an industry, this is a process, this is a form of, the ultimate form of corporate welfare that is just gaining a lot of steam. And I do think that there will come a time, just like other states that have done similar things to New Mexico, they get to the point where it just gets to be too much and the returns are not as what were promised. And the things that cannot continue forever eventually end. And that's what this thing reminds me of. But I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. And we will have to see what the net effect is to our state.
Yeah. And, kind of as an aside, it is important to note that oil prices have rebounded somewhat. They had been down in the low $50 a barrel range. They bounced back recently. Most analysts I read say that it's not really a supply and demand issue. It's America came very close, apparently, this week to going to war with Iran, and that would obviously cause a great deal of disruption to oil markets and oil prices, and so prices have gone up on the barrel. Again, having direct experience with driving through, the Amarillo and Oklahoma and even parts of Missouri, prices at the pump remain pretty darn low in those areas of the country. So I think, it's very hard to kind of parse everything out with the oil markets. But the point we've made is that if prices remain low for an extended period of time, that would have an impact on New Mexico's revenues. Just recently, Senate Finance Committee John Arthur Smith came out and said that we're staring at another $1 billion of revenue. And, prices could fall back in the oil patch, but they could also rise up. Who knows? The volatile situation in the Middle East this all, of course, directly translates to money for New Mexico's bottom line, money that we're going to continue to pour into the film industry when, alternatively, we would love to see some real investment in our state, some lower tax rates, more business-friendly tax code, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and just oil prices in perspective, back in October of 2018, they were far higher than they are now, even with the uncertainty in the Middle East. But the point being is that $40, $50, $60 oil in 2019, if you listen to what the majors talk about in terms of the level they need to be cash flow break even and profitable, it has gone down over the past 4, 5, 6 years. A lot of efficiencies that the oil people have learned how to put into place in the Permian Basin on both sides of the New Mexico-Texas border.
No doubt, with especially West Texas, the kind of the oil that's produced in New Mexico, the Permian Basin, et cetera. Those markets are a little bit segregated from the rest of the world because of the lack of infrastructure to get that product out of the region, and that kind of inability to get the product out leads to some form of insulation from that up and down, alongside the fact that the United States is so oil independent at this point. Not completely, and you don't want to be completely, but if something happens in the Middle East, it's not like back in the 70s and 80s when you had some shocks to the system. So we shall see where things go with the film subsidies and with oil prices, but they are, as we said last week, there is a direct relationship there between our ability to pay all this subsidy to the film industry and the price and production of oil. And that pretty much holds true for the rest of New Mexico's budget in terms of oil prices and production. But a big decision is coming up potentially this week. It's on the agenda for Tuesday night. The mandatory paid sick leave is coming before the Bernalillo County Commission, and a group out of the East Mountains, someone we've worked closely with named Bob Gore, has gone around, and he has at least at this point 47 businesses signed on in opposition to the mandatory paid sick leave that the commission is supposed to vote on Tuesday night. So we don't know how this vote is going to turn out, but I tell you what, hats off to Mr. Bob Gore for going out and getting these signatures. He probably by this time has close to, if not more than 50 businesses, all in the East Mountains, who are really, going to face a very tough decision, I think. And Commissioner Piscotti represents the East Mountains. She's a pretty new county commissioner. This is specifically targeted, I know, at swaying her. She's kind of a typical liberal progressive, but she's elected to represent a pretty conservative area. And the group's name is the East Mountain Conservative Outreach. Mr. Gore hasn't got a website up just yet, but we posted his press release at errorsoфenchantment.com, and you can read a little bit about it there. We're going to have a good contingent of folks at the county commission meeting on Tuesday night, and I know Carol White and the Restaurant Association will be there, and numerous business groups will be speaking in opposition as well. So the meeting is going to be at 4 p.m. I encourage people to sign up online. You can do that for county commission, to sign up to speak, and do that ahead of time so you can get on the agenda. And it'll be an action-packed, I'm sure it'll be a full and quite long meeting. But 4 p.m. is the meeting time. You definitely want to get in the room, probably no later than 3:30, which I find it strange that this elected body would move a meeting up in order to make it more difficult for working people to get there. But hey, that's kind of par for the course with government around here.
Yeah, no, no doubt about that. We've seen that in the past in other industries. It seems like the progressives are much better at rallying their troops, but businesses and the folks that are much more of a common sense pro business point of view have gotten increasingly on board with making their views known at this thing. And yeah, and get out there early, sign up online, and we will see how this vote happens. The impact will be profound to the businesses in the unincorporated areas of the county were it to pass. And then there is a distinct concern that should it pass the county, would the city council in Albuquerque bring it up and instead of hundreds of businesses have it apply to tens of thousands. So we'll have to see what happens.
No doubt about it. And if you can't make it, there's nothing to fear. And I understand folks may not want to spend a good chunk of their Tuesday afternoon and evening at a county commission meeting. Probably most folks have better things to do. They're not in the pay of Rio Grande Foundation or business interests and groups. Those groups are doing the best they can to get by. The left-wing special interest groups, they're getting their checks and they're leveraging their activists. But you can go to trickleave.org and send a note to your county commissioners. So make sure at the minimum you do that by no later than Tuesday. And that's really an important thing for folks to do. Make sure they make their opinions known to their county commissioners.
Yeah, and if you go to trickleave.org, also the link to sign up to speak, you can find that link there as well. It'll take you to the exact right page at the Bernalillo County to sign up to speak. Yeah,
and Wally, we talked a little bit last week about the Kids Count Index and the left-wing group, New Mexico Voices for Children, puts this out along with the Annie Casey Foundation. And I really took some degree of offense when the executive director of the Voices for Children, a gentleman named James Jimenez, who happened to work in the Richardson administration, he took this study, which is a pretty reasonable study. There's a few quibbles that we have with it. They have 16 variables. One of those variables is how many 3- and 4-year-olds are in school, and I'm not convinced that's a great metric for judging the welfare of New Mexico children. But if you have a 16 variable report and say 14 of them are solid, which I think is the case with this report, it's worth something. And New Mexico, unfortunately, winds up typically at the very bottom or close to it of these reports, and we wound up at 50th in the latest edition. And Jimenez, though, immediately, very quick to throw former Governor Martinez under the bus. He said the result was a real failure by the Martinez administration to invest in youth, children, and families in a way that made much of a difference in terms of these rankings. And Wally, I'm probably giving you a little bit of a leading question here, but when Jimenez's boss left office, do you know what lofty number New Mexico's kids count rating was at that time?
I'm going to guess we weren't 1 or 2. I would have if I were to guess, I would say we were down near the bottom, and we haven't fallen that far because we didn't have far to fall. What was the count, Paul?
We were at the lofty ranking of 49th in the nation.
Okay, so we've only gone down one place.
And so this is, of course, Jimenez's old boss, Bill Richardson. And, the Rio Grande Foundation, we definitely have a lot of concerns with Richardson and his leadership, mostly on things like the spaceport, the rail runner. He's the guy that created our film subsidy situation the way it is now. I never hear Voices for Children folks talking about those issues. I never hear them complain about money being diverted from projects that they hold near and dear, away from the children, so to speak. And yet here we are, and Jimenez is out saying that Susana Martinez is to blame for this terrible ranking. And I basically, in the op-ed, it's not going to appear in the Albuquerque Journal because we get limited bites at the apple there, but it's going to be up on our websites, errorsoфenchantment.com, riograndefoundation.org, and it's running as we speak in Las Cruces, Sun News, and newspapers all around the state. And the gist of it is that it's a reasonably good report, few quibbles, but certainly value there. And the idea that they're just trying to go after Governor Martinez, whether you talk about the drop of one whole point from 49th to 50th, whether you talk about the fact that neither Governor Martinez nor Bill Richardson were kings or queens of their domain, and that they have to deal with legislators. In Richardson's case, it was a Democrat-controlled legislature, and Martinez's case, it was mostly a Democrat legislature, and so she was stymied by legislative priorities. Of course, there's the global economy and some of the challenges that Martinez certainly faced in dealing with that, and Richardson as well. And finally, and I think the most important thing is that poverty is the ultimate reason New Mexico ranks 49th, 50th in these reports. Poverty is a complicated, multifaceted issue. Even if somebody really embarked on a potent free market reform agenda in New Mexico, which nobody has, it would take some time for results to actually filter down to the benefit of children and families. It takes some time for that social capital to build up. And I find Voices for Children's use of this report as a bludgeon, a hammer to go after former Governor Martinez, to be the kind of tit-for-tat politics that really doesn't do a lot of good for whether it's the state of New Mexico, the country as a whole, or wherever we're talking about. It's just not what we need to be doing in this country or this state.
Yes, and Voices for Children does a very good job of sounding the alarm. They really do have fallen short, I think, on the policies that they've advocated. And, just if you look at their mission statement on their website, they talk about it was founded to find a way to change the root causes of poor child well-being. And they name a lot of the ones you name, poverty, nutrition, violence, pollution, homelessness. But it's interesting, as they say, these systems, the things that are perpetuating these underfunded schools, as opposed to maybe underperforming schools, wage theft by unscrupulous employers. I'm not sure in the big scheme of things if that's I know a very progressive. That's a big progressive bell that they ring a lot, but I'm not sure, is that really what causes poverty in New Mexico, is this thing called wage theft? And so it is interesting. I wish Voices for Children's policy recommendations and accountability really came just a tiny bit closer to their mission of looking for root causes, as opposed to what they tend to advocate for is, like you say, this kind of progressive political tit for tat here in New Mexico.
Yeah, and of course, astute listeners to the show will recognize the fact that if not progressives, at least Democrats have controlled New Mexico for a vast majority of its history. I think their policies of big government and reliance on big government have been partially to blame for the sorry state of our overall economy and the state of our children. But even just democratic governance over a relatively long period alone is not enough to create the conditions of poverty that we see in New Mexico. It's a whole variety, a melting pot, if you will, of cultural issues, existential economic factors. We could talk about the resource curse, the resource availability. How does that insulate politicians from the impacts of bad economic policies? There's a lot of things to unpack there. But for them to just go after Governor Martinez, even though they clearly disagree with her policies. And I think I'm not going to toot our own horn, but I think that's something that the Rio Grande Foundation really sets itself apart on. We do have an agenda. We clearly support free markets and limited government. But when Governor Martinez, we just talked about the Facebook deal, and we definitely have concerns about that as an agreement, the benefits and demerits of that overall. But just because it was Governor Martinez putting something forward, we weren't going to blindly support it or blindly oppose it, just the same as we wouldn't blindly support or blindly oppose something that Bill Richardson or Michelle Lujan Grisham did. And while Lujan Grisham has certainly governed far to the progressive side of things, if she does something right, we will certainly jump on board with her policies wherever possible.
Yeah, and that is the bottom line to the ultimate yardstick. Are the policies making these problems better, or are they making them worse? And like I say, Voices for Children does a good job of saying how bad things are. At some point, you have to take a look at what are these policies that we're going to implement, as you say, in these very complicated issues of poverty to make things better for New Mexicans.
Yeah, and speaking of those economic issues, things have been better in New Mexico in the last couple of years, whether that's President Trump or the oil prices, the discoveries of the Permian, or some combination of those and other factors, including the global and national economies. It's impossible to say for sure, but I think they're all impactful. But we are going back to the well with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We went and looked at it in February, and as you probably recall, Wally and astute listeners, again, this is the four cities of New Mexico: Farmington, Las Cruces, Albuquerque, and Santa Fe, and their job growth. And then we just take, because there's numerous cities studied by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in Colorado, Texas, Arizona, and Utah, and we just take their average for those cities and those states. Farmington, at least between April 2018 and April 2019, managed to get out of the negative column. They had 0% job growth, not exactly stellar rate there for Farmington. Las Cruces 0.4%, Albuquerque 0.6%, Santa Fe 0.6%. So pretty mediocre for those New Mexico cities. Obviously, Farmington remains in a very difficult situation. It's only going to get more challenging as the coal-fired power plant shuts down there. But Colorado's average was 1.8%, so triple the rate of the top two New Mexico cities, Albuquerque and Santa Fe. Texas, 2.5%, Arizona, 2.8%, Utah, 3.2%. So you're talking almost quadruple the rate for Utah's grouping of cities as a whole versus Santa Fe and Albuquerque, which are at 0.6%. So when you're talking jobs, that's one very important way to get people out of poverty, whether it's folks waiting on the sidelines to get a job and be pulled into the workforce, or whether it is competition over existing workers, because the more jobs you have available, the more the price of that labor is going to go up. So rather than raising the minimum wage, that's how we recommend increased pay, is competition for those workers. And we clearly have that in our neighboring states, not so much in the land of enchantment, unfortunately.
Yes, and when there's a few things people use that I think they overuse, and one of the ones is the unemployment rate. You've talked on the podcast, and I believe I was on that one. If not, I certainly listened to it, about the labor participation rate being low in New Mexico, relatively speaking. And then the unemployment rate can be low if people stop looking for jobs. And so we've seen, over the past decade, not, as you point out, not that strong of job growth. And I do think we've also talked about the brain drain and others. And so while the unemployment rate may not be that high, the number of people working is certainly not as high as around surrounding states. And I do think that is in the current climate, maybe a better indicator of the robustness of the economy.
Yeah, given the strong economic growth nationwide, given that New Mexico is in a part of the country where people are tending to move to, it is definitely concerning, I think, for the long-term benefit of New Mexico's economy that we're seeing such slow growth job-wise compared to our more economically robust neighbors. And I know, Wally, you just mentioned that unemployment rate, but the Albuquerque Journal had a release on the unemployment rate by state. New Mexico remains at 5%. That's unchanged from April, so we were at 5% in May. Curiously enough, last May, we were at 4.8%, and I haven't checked it out yet, but I've got to imagine that given national unemployment being down at 3.6%, I would be hard-pressed to find another state that saw an increase in unemployment between May 2018 and May 2019. That seems really hard to believe. So not that 5% is bad. 5% is still good. It is still the second highest state unemployment rate in the country. Alaska remains very challenged economically, 6.4%. Another state that relies heavily on oil production. Of course, I was in Alaska, a year ago in May, and that's a state with even fewer people than New Mexico, much more geographically isolated, and oil production in Alaska has gone way down as that Alaskan oil field that exists has not seen the production grow, which is why the Trump administration was so interested in getting the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge open to really help Alaska get back on its feet as a state. But the Journal had their report on Friday. Unbelievable that New Mexico saw a 0.2% rate increase on its unemployment. So I know that partially is probably some people getting in the workforce. I know workforce participation rates in New Mexico have seen something of an increase, but given the overwhelming strength of the U.S. and New Mexico oil production, it's pretty shocking to see unemployment go up at this point in time anywhere in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely, because we know that unemployment in southeast New Mexico, it is as low as it can possibly get. People are crying out for workers in virtually every industry, not just oil and gas, but all the service industries, all of the secondary industries, just, restaurants, lodging. There's just a huge need down there. And so that's got to be much, that negative statistic has to come from much of the rest of the state because it's not southeast New Mexico that's causing that problem.
Yeah, if you could have a negative unemployment rate, and I could argue that, maybe the federal government should come up with a negative unemployment rate if you have job openings that are larger numerically than the number of people who are unemployed in a given place, whether it's nationally or a state or whatever. You could argue that the government should put that as a negative unemployment rate. And certainly southeast New Mexico, the Permian Basin, would fall into that category. And as one of our wonderful guests, Carla Kugler of the Associated Builders and Contractors, put it, if you can pass a drug test, I'll use the more PC language than she did, you have a job. You pretty much can get a job in southeast New Mexico. And certainly with that boom of oil production going on, filtering through the rest of the state, I might add, through in the form of spending, no matter how ill-advised, the fact that New Mexico lags the country so mightily, and it lags its neighbors in job creation, definitely is a warning that we're not seeing the public policy climate in Santa Fe change for the best. And I know it's an obvious statement, but we're really seeing a worsening of the public policy climate coming out of Santa Fe.
Yeah, in general, it seems like we're, the California economy has been, the envy of the world for decades. It's the size of its economy is stronger than many countries out there, but their policies cumulatively have gotten to the point where things are slowing down in California, and businesses are leaving and looking to leave, and there's some storm clouds that are beginning to form on the horizon in California. New Mexico did not have its kind of policy switch to align with what's going on in places like California. We never had our heyday of the economic boom like they did with high tech and everything else. So, but we're following them from a policy point of view much more so than other states that have done a lot better economically and don't seem to have as much of a policy death wish as places like California and increasingly New Mexico have.
Yeah, and one quick thing to add kind of in this general vein is something I neglected to mention or put in my notes on this show. New Mexico's credit rating holds steady according to Moody's. That's AA2, and I'm not a real guru on the ratings, but given the oil boom happening in New Mexico, $1 billion surplus last year, $1 billion surplus expected this coming year, and all you can do is hold steady, that's another indicator that these credit rating services, and they don't always see eye to eye with the Rio Grande Foundation, that is for darn sure, they don't necessarily feel very comfortable with the overall health of New Mexico's economy. Specifically mentioned in the journal article, it's tough to actually get the credit rating reports because you have to be a subscriber and pay a bunch of money to them. But they mention high Medicaid enrollment, which that's, back to Voices for Children. They see Medicaid as a great program that people should be on. They want to encourage more and more of it. They want to have a buy-in program. They'd love to have some kind of universal healthcare, but we see Medicaid as another federal program, the welfare program, that encourages people to not work or that discourages them often from advancing in the workforce as they lose eligibility for Medicaid as they make more money. And then another concern for Moody's remains a concern that we have, which is the public employee pensions and the increase in unfunded liabilities that we're seeing with those. And let's just say that it's safe to say that the governor, despite putting money in, additional money in during the last session, the governor and the legislature are very disinclined towards any kinds of real reforms that'll make the public employee pension systems actually functional, stable, and get us out of the jam that we're in on those systems. So, it's going to be easy if and when the U.S. and New Mexico economy start to slide for us to say, I told you so, because a lot of people have been predicting a recession for some time. But I really want to emphasize that while things have been looking pretty good for the last, say, couple of years, there are definitely clouds on the horizon, and we're going to hope that something happens maybe in the 2020 session on, say, tax reform or some other reform issue that we've been talking about, because something needs to happen with all this oil money available. There needs to be a good free market policy reform of some kind.
Besides giving it to Hollywood.
Yes.
They've got a good one.
Free market.
They don't have a good one. They have an effective way to get rid of all that excess money now. Yeah, let's look at the investment. And then just a little bit about the credit ratings of the state. They call out Medicaid. New Mexico is among the highest under a thing called the Federal Medical Assistance Percentage. We get a bigger chunk of our Medicaid paid for by the feds because of low per capita income. Well, the federal government, they keep spending like crazy, and I do think the rating agencies perhaps are looking at even the federal government may have to put the brakes on a little bit, and that could definitely flow downhill to a state like New Mexico. And then the unfunded pension issue that we have, it's not put on our books, but the credit rating agencies certainly know about it, and it's certainly something to keep an eye on. And I would love to see some of this $1 billion in additional funding be somehow talked about. Are they going to start to reform that as well to get rid of some of that debt on the state employee pension? But we will have to see. I'm not going to hold my breath on that one, but it would sure be nice to see some sort of a commitment towards that if we do have all this excess money that they are projecting at this point.
No doubt about it, Wally. There are plenty of uses for that $1 billion surplus that we could adequately address if the Rio Grande Foundation was able to manage those dollars. New Mexico would be a lean, mean, job-creating machine. Unfortunately, as we've said, and in almost jest, but not really, Governor Lujan Grisham, at least to date in this legislative session, really played out this way. It's as if she took all of the Rio Grande Foundation policy papers and issue briefs and op-eds and decided to do the exact opposite in every single way. So something's got to change on that, because even a broken clock is right twice a day. And I'm hoping that at some point Michelle Lujan Grisham will see the light on some of these issues and take the opportunity to reform government, because back-to-back years of $1 billion surpluses in a state the size of New Mexico don't come along very often. But Wally, we will. One last thing, Chris Ann Hall, lunch tickets are still available. July 10th is the date on that. We're going to have a great event there with lawyer, constitutional scholar, advocate, and firebrand public speaker Chris Ann Hall. Check the Rio Grande Foundation website for details. By all means, please bring a friend. We're all in this together, folks. July 10th, it's a Wednesday. Marriott Pyramid is the location. And we've got a podcast with Chris Ann Hall. I believe it'll air this week. So Chris Ann is great, very, very well-versed in the Constitution, and doesn't take partisan sides or pull any punches when she talks about the U.S. Constitution and what it means.
Yes, and she is a spirited and very passionate, engaging presenter on the Constitution. And believe me, one of the points I have heard her made is that they try to make the Constitution something that only constitutional scholars know. This is written in plain English by people that had real meaning, and you will certainly be able to follow her points in her talk, and I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a great one.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.